Again, it's at least life-size. I've always been a huge fan of trying to sculpt in addition to draw, especially if you're not going to be a sculptor, you're a painter or a drafts person. I think that's the right way to say it now. And yet, at the same time, sculpture is probably the most valuable thing you could do as a painter. Because if you have to put your hands on the clay and really construct something like this, it's just nothing like it. It's just because you have to literally contemplate it three-dimensionally. And if you spend your entire time trying to contemplate things in a pseudo three-dimensional way without actually sculpting it, it can be vastly less efficient, put it that way. I don't know if anybody has anything to say about that, but one of the reasons why the Academy was always a magical place, I thought, was because they demanded that the people that were studying painting and majoring in painting take at least one sculpture class. And that was just awesome, because once you take a single sculpture class, you're hooked. And even if you're going to pursue painting and be a painting teacher, you just can't get enough of it. Because this idea of, for example, I'm here, and I only know through trying to build it in clay that form has got to go back in space. It doesn't look like it necessarily, but it feels like it over time. So I'm going to see if I can continue in this process. I've got a couple of issues with the angle and the way the ankle reads, or the heel, I should say. And then, of course, I want to go back and follow my own advice, which is acknowledge the ground plane. Really helps, you see. So we get a form of the ground plane, and we can already see the sort of drapery-like way in which the whole body unwinds. It's really quite extraordinary. It's like a piece of fabric fluttering in the wind, and it doesn't just flutter up into the anatomical leg. It spins around and drops back into some sort of headquarters back there. And so I want to make sure that whatever I do, at the very least, I can nod to that as well. And I can see the calcaneal tendon already, which is less important than getting the shape started effectively. So I'm going to use the shape for the tibia, which is what we're involved in here. We have the tibia, and then again to the Y thing. Really like the idea of Y. I hope you do as well. The Y concerning this area is the flexor retinaculum and all of those flexor tendons, all the musculature, the abductor hallucis. That's where we are in this area. And we're going to see if we can put this together for a couple of minutes and then maybe structure the right hatch mark for this. And I'm going to use a hatch mark that'll give me the excuse to carry the form up and around. So you have to remember the arc. And I was saying before that the foot is a form which is under duress, and yet it doesn't always feel like it. On the medial side, medial aspect inside of the foot, so to speak, doesn't feel at all like we're in an area that's under a lot of pressure and stress, even though it is. We know it's under the pressure and the stress because the system is arched and drops down to a collision point here. And the system additionally wants to reverberate down into here in a secondary collision point. We could almost say that there's a hierarchy, right? That this is the most important or the most monumental collision point. This is secondary. And there's one back there that's tertiary. And the one that's tertiary, we could see if we walk around the room and such. We have to be aware, though, that much of what we're going to be encountering back in here will be related to the toe. So you don't simply want to go and articulate the most outward projecting moment or point as the third point of the weight, because it doesn't work that way. The weight is proximal to the toe. And I just find that, again, wonderful, because it makes the drawing of a form like this less simple. And so as I lean over one direction and the other direction, I think I really can see something back here that makes me contemplate what's going on. in so much as I've got 1, 2, 3. I've got those 3 points of connection, those weight moments. And maybe I could do a better job here and talk a little bit less by redistributing these points of collision. Now, granted, I can't really see that one on its underside, but I get enough of it, a top, that I know I'm onto something. And I'm just going to maneuver that one over a little bit further and try to separate. Remember this ramp here we were talking about? There it is on this other side. Climbing up, extremely foreshortened, and yet we know that there's a rhythm to it. We didn't get much of a chance to talk about the rhythm that I want to get into right now. We did discuss this, so I could go in and find some of that arc. But the rhythm in through here really relates to these forms. You see this kind of sweeping thing, but driving around that direction. So you could definitely envision reverberating lines like that. Even lines that then go in and encapsulate that first distal, it's the epiphysis of the first metatarsal. So, and there's a really nice thing about it, which is it's very block-like and it has a kind of corner on it. The corner generally sits right about there, and it becomes the jettison point for this marvelous concave form. They say there are no concavities in the figure. I beg to differ. I think there are plenty of concavities. And speaking of weightless, isn't it awesome that you have a marker here for the great toe that almost appears to accommodate a concave surface? You with me on this? This here? Whereas just next to it, next door, is something totally the opposite in the form of the second digit, third digit, fourth digit. So the spirit of the form in these is a completely different thing. So with that said, I want to go in and change my mark making to see if I can investigate more effectively what's happening. So I put in, a marker here, and I put in a marker right there. So that would be the ground plane right there. That's very important. That marker for the ground plane, it's hard to overestimate its importance because it works with this marker for the ground plane. These communicate whether there's a synthesis of this surface and that form on the surface. And if there isn't, you'll find this a lot when you teach this. If you're trying to help somebody understand the top of the foot versus the top of the ground plane, you have to make adjustments in the size of the top. And the bigger you make this, the more you're going to be looking down on it. And the smaller you make it, the more you're going to be pivoting the form in space, which is, again, really quite enabling, and it makes you feel like you're a real participant and creator in the process of evaluating the aesthetic nature of the forms of the body in action. So then as I go in this direction, I pull a line in a different direction to begin to signal the toe, the grand toe, the great toe, whatever you want to call that toe. And then I brought this back, I find that marker there. This is one of the more valuable markers, I find, when I'm drawing the full figure in space, because this marker between the great toe and the second one is, for all intents and purposes, the long axis of the foot. So you're going to want to take a look at that and remember that that little absence of form is a great signal for you. There's the roof line. Again, flexor mass, calcaneus. It's never a bad idea to try to indicate a bit of difference between the flexor mass and flexor retinaculum in some marker to denote the calcaneus, which is going to be worth investigating, worth exploring a little bit more in your foot. Even the nature of this form, we know already it has its peculiarities. And we're looking at it, it's not simply a block. There's going to have to be some more to it. There are these little pockets, compression zones, or something like that. And then we get further and further up and in toward that other pocket, that corridor, where these flexors emerge from underneath of soleus and travel to the deep portions, the plantar aspects of the foot. So, I don't know about you, but I've always been sort of fascinated about this trajectory, this I called it a conduit. It's like a channel here, driving in this direction. One of the things that helps the channel make more sense is it's maneuvering around a form that can't be repositioned, and that would be tibia. So you want to look for the tibia as much as you possibly can. You could really drive it in there. You can see it's under her vessel right there. It's under our model's vein. And so we could choose to draw the vein in, we could ignore the vein. It's up to you. But there definitely is something happening with respect to climbing out from under the tibia and re-engaging in these arch structures you see. So the other thing about this is we encounter, right in this area, we encounter a difference, and this is where you get into the really challenging region of the foot. You've got to sort of lift up, again, sort of describe visually for a minute or two, contemplate, look at your forms. What I'm searching for is this. I'm searching for this prominence here, and I'm trying to make this prominence, and maybe its neighbor, totally different than what's happening here. And I'm kind of lucky because at least now the light is semi-agreeable. And that light allows me to separate that sailing, cascading first metatarsal from the surrounding structure, at least in theory, before I go any further. So I put these together. It's too rough at this early measure, but you can see kind of my thinking. As a matter of fact, I may diagram my thinking for you. So I've got to be really clear on the location of that navicular. And I know navicular, and it's right about in through here. And what we've got happening is this series of marvelous folds happening, because in the grand scheme of things, when we talk about our anatomical movements and all of that, we discuss the idea of plantar flexion, right, and dorsiflexion. This is dorsiflexion, but forced into dorsiflexion by the activity of the lower leg. You know what I'm talking about? You can see that in the drawing yourself. So you realize that the maneuvering through the hatch mark is no easy task. You've got to be aware that the hatch mark is going to be all-encompassing. It's going to help you wrap your mind around what's going on, similar to the Langer lines that Michael talks so eloquently about. The Langer lines that are showing you trajectory, sort of channels and stuff in the form. And then that'll carry us into, again, that outcropping form, catching some warmer light, and that moves us over to the first metatarsal, which is where we are here. A lot of this is simply going to be the trajectory of the first metatarsal, which will then travel into the second and the third. So I don't think that a lot of that is too formidable. This is the hard part, as I've always seen it anyway. And it's hard because it's just unfamiliar and nobody really gets into it. We all just focus on toes and that's the end of it. But there's a lot more to it than that. And if I were studying today, I'd spend some time doing some diagramming, maybe, doing certainly some light and shadow, and trying to find more clarity as to what is going on. Do some more light and shadow, and I need to actually kind of shut up here and just draw. Any questions about anything at all? It's a very good question. Yeah, it really is. Because my footprint heel would seem to indicate that I should go that way and that I should somehow wrap that direction, it might be that I've got to do a combination of this and that, and then maybe this. You see what I mean? Because if I could do that, then I could grab probably more effectively onto the clay and just sort of, you know, support it in an underplane sense. Because what's really great about the foot is you're launching. It's not just an arch, it's like a launch point from here to here, around. It's a lot of fun because you can express a real flair with the trajectory of the forms as they slam down on the ground plane and then make their shift, make their pivot going the other direction. So I think it's probably a combination of those, where the hatch mark would be more challenging and may not work as well as how could I get in here and differentiate this part from this part? You know, because the idea of this part would be based upon the projection of the tibia, which is clearly here. And so there's got to be like a little move here to indicate the construction of the tibia. Tibia is a beautiful bone. It has this marvelous trapezoidal block-like medial malleolus form, very different than the as I see it, the cutting edge, the diamond tip of the fibula, as I see it. I don't always get fortunate in seeing it. It is different, but it's a wonderful form. It's also higher, as you know, so it's lifting up in some respects so it can allow the channel to move beneath it, the channel of all that material. But I don't want these hatch marks to be the same. Another thing I have going for me is if I could take the hatch and move in this direction, then I might be able to just sort of wrap or envelop that channel. Because again, where am I? I'm in the flexor hallucis. I'm in the flexor digitorum. I'm in tibialis posterior. That's what's going on in here. There's no mystery. Once you get into the musculature, you know what you're supposed to see. Whether it is what you actually see, it's usually a combination of things, really. But you just continue to search and identify, you know, what you're looking for. You're definitely not looking for the fifth metatarsal layer, right? You're only looking for certain things. And a lot of this is discovering the nature of the form to a more profound, proficient level as you go forward. You know, why don't we take 5 and then finish up, okay? Let's take 5. Okay, I'm ready for you. Great. Beautiful. All right, great. All right, so to finish up, I mean, it's just hard for me to believe now that I'm done my presentation or just about that anybody's going to have a better time than you this afternoon drawing feet. I mean, it is such a blast and a real pleasure to talk about it with you. But it's my discussion, probably like anybody's, is potentially a little bit deceptive, because the foot isn't going to be gained in a day. It's going to take a while. It's just going to take a little while to get your yes, your foot. I almost said it. You said it. Okay, good. That's fine. That's fine. But I mean, because you start to compile this thing with everything else, and it's just like, oh my God, you know. And I know you don't have any time because you're in all these other classes. Does anybody have any evening classes on Tuesday? No? All right, good. Nobody does. Today's Tuesday, yeah. My goal, as I've always said, is to make you so exhausted on Tuesday that you fall asleep in your evening class. And if that is the case, then I'm very proud. Just kidding. Anyway, the idea of going into the this area here is just, I mean, it's the bomb. It's so awesome. The navicular is where we're going at this point in time, and it's one of these highly conceptualized structures. I want to show you a few things that I've already been applying poetic license to some extent, and one of them is the reach of the talus bone. So I've got this little highly foreshortened area where I'm pulling overlaps over overlaps, like I'm allowing this astragalus-like transition plane to exist, but I know that talus is pretty high up and it's fairly limited. So I don't mind, saying that this region is going to be narrow and that the tibia is going to be pretty broad, because you can see how broad it is from your vantage point where you're sitting. It's a pretty big, thick area. And tibia is going to be something you have to contend with. You know its rhythm is very particular, but it's always struck me as kind of strange how limiting the talus is, the reach of that. So my poetic license here was to kind of challenge that fold right there and lift up by applying this, because I know talus has to be underneath of that. Talus is in there. Even though it's covered doesn't mean it's gone. So I plug in talus conceptually. There's my great spool shape underneath of this, and that pulls this kind of S-curve back and anchors it up against the secondary convexity of the calcaneus. Really want that to happen. The calcaneus, by the way, I could also use the other hatch marks with, but there's a tight calcaneal tendon right in through here that we're going to look at in the cadaver drawing class in a couple of weeks. It's going to be a lot of fun, because once all this stuff gets stripped away, it's just incredible. It's so clear and amazing. This will be set back a lot. That's why I need a darker tone, just to make sure that I remind myself that it's pitched back. And then as I drive out to here, the way the navicular sits, it's like a finger pointing out in our direction. So I want to kind of draw some of that in, again, to conceptualize it with you. So the navicular in this block-like way is pushing out in that direction, and it's going to sweep under. It's going to sweep this way. What's the best way to do it? I should probably turn it the other direction. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff. So if I were to go in there and draw a little C shape, now you don't do this in a foot, all right? But if I draw a little C shape, that's that deadbolt thing I was talking about. So the design of navicular is it will accommodate the tendon of tibialis posterior. But more than that, as you think about the contour line, and I'm just going to trace some contour on this, you've got this structure which is driving down underneath the arch of the foot, right? There's going to be a termination in terms of the light and the shape. And that navicular is going to push out toward us, so it's a really beautiful and interesting form. And it's going to really, as well, contribute to that structure, that continental divide that we talked about, where you're essentially going to be hitting the first cuneiform in through here, which is going to be, or I should say the second one is what I used in the diagram. The first one, we had a sense of the wedding cake, which was flipped on its end. So if I put the wedding cake in through here, it would sit just like that, like a wedge of cheese. Does that make sense? You see the wedge of cheese? No? I can darken it. I'm doing that internally to try to spell out the idea that this is where some of those component structures are, so that when I go in and say that the hatch mark does this, it's related to my idea of where the cuneiform is, because these are the hardest ones to visualize. You know, they're just really crazy tight in there, and otherwise they're just random shapes.
So the top edge of the cuneiform, the farthest one.
Bless you. I think what we'd have to do is press pretty hard, honestly, because what we discussed earlier today is we were taking these blocks. So first cuneiform was like that, no doubt. We talked about that. That's an important hatch mark line right there, which I'm getting at right now. Second cuneiform is this, flipped wedding cake.
Yeah.
Third cuneiform, flipped wedding cake again. There's your gradual drop. You know, beautiful, the way it's structured. So that's what you're kind of thinking about in that region, is this not random arc, but a very specific arc which is going to drop dramatically once you get past number 2. You know, it's the way it's going to function. It doesn't look very sightly here, does it? But I'm trying to give you some information that we sometimes don't gain access to, and we don't have time for a schematic. So if I take that away and then go back to the light and shadow, I think if I do a good enough job, there should be at least a clarification a little bit that the light is doing that. You can see there's definitely an echo of that first cuneiform as it runs up and into that navicular. And the navicular, it's wedded to this rhythm, because that's tibialis posterior. What makes navicular a little hard to register sometimes is the tendon of tibialis is covering it. So tibialis is going to drive this direction because it's running into cuneiform and first metatarsal. So tibialis anterior is really giving you a different rhythmic sense as it hooks underneath of all of that. You know, it's coming from up and through there. So this region is just endlessly fascinating, totally engrossing in terms of what it can offer you, because it takes away the mystery. So you're as keen on what you're searching for here as is your mandate for this region, because everything's got its own territory, its own map in a sense, but try to make it a three-dimensional map. Any other questions? Yeah. What you have is you have this very beautiful kind of trochlea portion.
That is the talus.
That's the talus. Yeah, that's the talus.
What is the tibia and what's the
Okay, so I talked about the wrench.
Yes.
Tibia is the mainstay on the wrench, and the TI and the TA is in there as well. So the talus is going to drop down. Here's where you get that rhythm that drops down this way. And then there's this kind of really weird tube. And that's where you get the neck and the head of the talus. And it's that tube, like a finger going this way, that runs into the construction of the boat. See, I put it here. This is why it is worth bringing up in my drawing. So, talus, there's the spool, okay? There's the finger coming forward, that's the head, and that's that crazy navicular bone, which is at an angle, a pitched angle. So when you go in here and search these forms out, it's a decent place to structure a hatch mark as you're going that way, versus as you hatch your way or carve your clay to cut underneath. You know, we're really going for more of a master's degree level understanding, and this isn't the kind of form you try to take on or even teach in undergraduate setting, because it's just, it confounds you because it's not easy. But I feel like we should go for the harder part sometimes. Okay. I think we're good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. We should have a hand for our model. Thank you.